Boy, do we got some mid-season drama. An exciting round 8 of Major League Rugby leads to a fun weekend of fantasy MLR, shaking up the very first fantasy league in Major League Rugby. All while there's another fantasy game that enters the mix. We discuss all that, talk about who's hot on the waiver wire, reveal the top players in fantasy MLR now that all the teams have had their bye, and of course, look ahead to MLR's round 9. The Fantasy Ruckers show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 61 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. And round 8, another exciting weekend of Major League Rugby. It feels like it's been an absolute blast so far this season. Maybe some of the most exciting Major League Rugby that we've seen up to this point in the history of the league. And it's made for a very fun weekend in the Fantasy MLR. We've just now passed around the halfway point, or approaching the halfway point of the Major League Rugby season. We passed the halfway point of the Fantasy MLR season. Everyone's had buys now in the league, and it's been some exciting stuff so far, like we said. And Matt, so far, you're quite enjoying the way that it's been going for you in the world of Fantasy MLR.
I mean, look, I'll be lying if I said I wasn't enjoying it, but look, we also got to shout out our boy Van. He couldn't be here today to celebrate the win, but I told him I'd celebrate for him. So here we are. We're celebrating. The guy's the farthest away from last place that I've ever seen him in Fantasy MLR.
Very true.
I'm the farthest away from last place that I've ever seen myself in Fantasy MLR.
The longest that you've been at the point where you are right now in the league. It's incredible.
This is true. So we're both just rolling here. And, I'm going to keep saying it every week. Every time Vandy gets a win, every time I get a win, I'm hoping next week that we just keep it on rolling on this show.
Absolutely. And of course, Matt Yee, Ryan Yee here with you here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. We got a jam-packed episode in this one. We're obviously going to break down the matches that happened in round 8 and the fantasy implications that they had. And what a weekend. We had some really, really fun results here. Some exciting matchups, some unexpected results. Yep. Really had a little bit of everything. So we're going to break that all down. We're also going to obviously go over some news. Interesting news that I mentioned in the teaser. Not so much from a MLR standpoint, from roster moves and things like that, but there seems to be another fantasy game in the mix here that is making things a little bit interesting. Yeah, maybe a little bit of competition, but we're gonna have a closer look at what that all means and kind of break down and give you guys our first opinions. Obviously, we've been the ones that have been trying to make fantasy MLR a reality for the past couple seasons, and it's interesting to see a new approach here to fantasy rugby. Definitely not your conventional approach. So we're gonna have a nice little discussion on that, talk a little bit of other happenings around the league. Of course, give you that update about these wins that are seeming to be racked up here by your host here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. How that's all shaking up the official Fantasy Ruckers League, the very first fantasy MLR league in Major League Rugby up to this point. It's been an absolute blast here in our second season. We're going to break that all down, give you the latest in the matchup scores, the standings, and all that. And then, of course, give you some waiver wire advice. Talk a little bit now that we mentioned that everyone's had their bye so far in the Major League Rugby season, now that NOLA and Dallas have both sat out their week here. We're going to go over some of the top players in Major League Rugby from a fantasy perspective now that everyone is on an even playing field now. And then, of course, look ahead to round 9 about what you can expect for these matchups for the Fantasy MLR season. Before we get to that, of course, like we say every single week, if you aren't already, make sure you're giving us a follow. All the social handles are above there on the YouTube video page, at the Fantasy Ruckers, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We're all on there. Give us a like, subscribe if you like what you've been seeing on a weekly basis. It's been absolutely a blast. And of course, you can find all those links down below if you're listening to the podcast version. podcast version of the show as well. And then, of course, if that's all not enough for you, we do have a Discord channel as well. That link you can find in the description too. It's been fun, kind of interacting with our fantasy MLR community, the Fantasy Ruckers community. It's been steadily growing. People joining the league, joining the Discord community. Again, that's where you're probably going to hear first when this thing is able to expand, and you'll get your spot in a league too. So you want to check that out as well. So super fun stuff. But yeah, let's get into some of these news and notes, Matt, before we get to what you've been waiting for in that Fantasy Ruckers League update.
I mean, Ryan, look, it's happening every week now.
Is it getting tiring now?
I'm starting to get tired of hearing my name at the top every time, getting announced first as the guy, and it's getting more exciting to hear what's going on in the rest of the league. Sometimes you just got to sit back and enjoy.
The novelty of you sitting at that top spot is wearing off. Is that what you're saying?
Ryan, I was talking to her mom today.
Yeah.
And she said, the longer you stay at the top, you're going to have to start figuring out how to be humble. You're going to start figuring out how to be humble, Matthew, or else, it's going to come off pretty bad. So here it is. I'm starting to become humble. I've been at the top for so long. It's getting a little bit tiring. I got to humble it down a little bit, so that's what I'm going to try and do on this episode. Cause I can only win so much. And if I'm just going to keep going and going and going,
I'm sensing.
I don't know how much we can talk about it.
I'm sensing a hint of sarcasm in there, but our league members can take that for what you will. But it is funny though, as the weeks go on, I feel like I've been waiting for this cliff to happen, where at some point it's got to drop off. But hey, we're 8 weeks.
We'll get there, Ryan. I will tell you once. Yes, once we get there, I will tell you why I was so scared about this week. But let's get through some news and notes first. We'll get to the update. We'll hear your horns and trumpets, and then I'll bash some ridiculous stuff about the league, and then we'll move on.
All right, let's talk some news and notes here. Really not that busy of a signing week. We had a few signings last week that actually happened to have some pretty decent fantasy implication in this past week, and we'll talk about that in our round 8 breakdown. But this week, very much lighter when it comes to the roster signing standpoint. Really only one that is hopping on the radar here, and that is the return of a Rugby Atlanta player in Connor Cook. He is returning to the squad. Briefly retired after the 2022 season, and now he's hitting the pitch once again. And this is a guy that actually has some fantasy relevance, a second row player, which again, we've mentioned on this show. It's hard to come by second row players that really are productive from a fantasy perspective. But Connor Cook, last season, under our new fantasy stats, was pretty good, finishing in the top 105 players in fantasy MLR, racking up a total of 104.3 fantasy points on the season, which is pretty impressive stuff. And then again, finishing at that 102nd spot in the entire league. So hey, Connor Cook might be a guy that you may be eyeing, maybe not from a necessarily staple piece of your roster. I don't think he's going to be a big time waiver wire pickup heading into this week. I feel like we're still waiting for a big time signing when it comes to MLR. Last year we had Nehemiah Scudder, we had Waisaki Nahalo that people are just jumping on. We haven't had this season. Don't think Connor Cook is that, but nonetheless, if you're in need of a second row, he may be a guy that you look to if you need to stream someone in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. Atlanta's got Mumson and they got Justin Basson that has really been the staples of that second row. I think they are missing a little bit of depth there. So it's nice to see them kind of pick that up, and I'm sure he'll be a great guy coming off the bench. Like you said, not somebody who's going to start for them, at least on a regular basis.
Right. And I guess what I'm saying is that once those rosters come out on a weekend, again, you're not putting waiver wire bids on this guy. But if you see Connor Cook starting for Rugby Atlanta week, maybe you throw him in your lineup because you're in need of a second row player. He's a guy that's 100%. Definitely has some fantasy implication if he gets the minutes being played. That's for sure. But yeah, other than that, really no other roster signings across the league here. It seems like teams are really getting into the groove of things as we approach the halfway mark of the MLR season, heading into round 9. But I guess from the fantasy side of things, not often are we getting news when it comes to fantasy MLR. But hey, we got some news here, and it looks like another fantasy game has entered the mix. I teased it at the top of the show, but the Major League Rugby making the announcement a handful of days ago about Oval 3 and saying that we've had inklings. They came out with the press release about how there is going to be this game that is coming, but we now have some more information. Apparently the marketplace is now live for Oval 3. And for those of you who don't know why it's called a marketplace, because it's not just any fantasy game. This is a NFT fantasy game. So they're kind of mixing two different worlds, which is interesting to see. For me, Matt, this is not as much your authentic or traditional fantasy platform that you typically see, at least in your major four sports, right? When you think of fantasy sports, I don't think this is something that you really think about. I think, and obviously there's no bias here, but when I think about fantasy sports or fantasy rugby, fantasy MLR, I think about a setup that like we have here at the Fantasy Ruckers show in terms of drafting.
I mean, even when
lineup.
Even when you think about the European style, like the Super Brew, the Premier League, even that isn't anything like this Oval 3. So it seems to be a completely new type of concept or way of looking at fantasy sports.
And for those of you who may have not read the article yet about how this all operates, so the way it's seeming like it's going to work is that people are going to be able to buy these cards, I guess these NFTs that are on this marketplace. And the cards range in price based on the rarity of these cards, and these cards will be released on a weekly basis. And depending on how many cards of that player there are, again, that price is going to change. And I guess through that is how you're going to build your quote unquote fantasy roster. And it looks like these rosters are considered of 5 different players. You got a first row, you got a second and back row in that second card spot, which is interesting. You got a halfback in your third card spot, the back a fourth card spot, and then you have a flex position in that fifth card spot. So a lot smaller than what we're operating here at the Fantasy Ruckers. Interesting that they're mixing the lock and flanker position, because we know from a fantasy perspective that those two have very differing fantasy production standpoints. But what makes things interesting is something that they're doing differently than what we aren't doing is that there's now this weighting system. They call it a global score graph. And based on the position that the card is, the certain stats are weighted differently. So I would assume for a front row player, strength type stats, which I'm not quite sure what falls under the strength type stats, those get weighted more for those positions.
I think it's how many bench presses they do during the day.
Yeah, exactly. Versus a winger player who may not have as big of an emphasis on there. So it's a little bit complicated. Again, not really something that I think of when it comes to your traditional fantasy platform. It is very interesting. It is very creative. But when it comes to fantasy sports, I still don't think that this is quite what people are looking at when they think about fantasy MLR.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a new thing. And I'll preface this by saying, any way that the platform of the MLR can grow, and this seems to be maybe something that is expanding across, 3 leagues. I think it's a French league as well. So people who are interested in French league might be able to get, guys who are in the MLR on their team as well. But I thought the MLR already tried their NFT thing last year and they kind of just did it. And then, I thought NFTs were done with. I thought we were done with the monkey pictures and, the NFTs and stuff, but I guess it's still a thing. I don't know. I don't really love the idea of buying into fantasy. Fantasy is something that should be available. No, there's no gates in order to play.
Sure.
But look, I guess NFTs need to be bought. And it is what it is. But I thought NFTs were like 2021 type.
I mean,
Ryan.
at the end of the day, it's not surprising. I kind of, this was my initial reaction. Obviously, the Major League Rugby's in this to make money, right? I mean, at the end of the day, leagues are there to make money, and a platform like this is obviously going to make a whole lot more money than maybe, or at least the setup that this has is going to be a lot more appeasing towards kind of the money making side of things, as opposed to kind of the traditional fantasy setup that we have here. But nonetheless, it's going to be creative, it's going to be interesting.
You know what the great thing is about fantasy, Ryan, is you can do all of them. You can do all the leagues in the world. You can do Super Bro, you can do Oval 3, you can do the Fantasy Ruckers League.
That's true.
You can do all of them combined, and that's the great thing about fantasy. That's the great thing about growing the sport, is that you can find all the ways that you possibly can to get involved and do it. And this is just another platform to
now from what I see here, there isn't, I'm not quite sure. The values of these players are going to change. I'm not quite sure how this like how the fantasy game is actually paid. They explain here on the article how points are tallied, but is it just that you're gaining value for these cards? Are you facing other players? Is there like a leaderboard system? I'm not too sure. I'm sure those kind of news and those kind of updates will come as this gets developed. But nonetheless, the marketplace is open. You can check that out. But again, it isn't. I guess to put a bow on it, it isn't your traditional fantasy platform setup like the Fantasy Ruckers, where it's your traditional drafting your own team, going up against another fantasy team each week, setting your lineups, waiver wire pickups, all these things that you think about when you talk about fantasy in any sport, baseball, football, basketball, hockey. It isn't exactly that. Not that it's any worse or not that it's any less fun. It's just something that's different. And going into this, it'll be fun and interesting to see how it kind of operates, and especially from the scoring perspective, how that kind of differs from what we have scoring wise here on the Fantasy Ruckers show.
I mean, just know the last thing I'll say is that if I was into NFTs, if it was 2021, I'd beat you in that too. I'm being humble this episode, guys.
All right, well that's a good segue. We'll talk about why you are so confident here in the Commissioner Yee's League update.
I told you the trumpets were coming. You know what's coming after the trumpets.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye, hear ye.
Exactly.
Hear ye, hear ye. Here is Commissioner Yee with a Fantasy Ruckers League update. Again, you can check out all the latest when it comes to the Fantasy Ruckers League on the fantasyruckers.com. Not only do we have the latest fantasy results there, but we also have stats of these fantasy players from a fantasy perspective and from just a general perspective too. If you're just interested in stats and want to see what type of numbers, tries, tackles, meters gained these players are accumulating over the season, we have them on there on the fantasyruckers.com. So make sure you check that out and have fun with the website. Again, big shout out to Alistair Kirschpool, who's the mastermind behind this fantasyruckers.com website and has made this season so much more fun and so much more improved than our inaugural season. But let's get into it. And you talk about wins, Matt. And why don't you explain to me first? Well, let's go through the matchups in round 8. And we had some pretty interesting one that had some pretty big implications in terms of how the standings in our Fantasy Ruckers League have really developed here and shaken out, because it's getting tight once again. But for you were taking on Eagles Overseas, who found himself in the middle of the standings, right within that playoff race, able to squeak out a win here, 73.7 to 67.5.
Yeah, I mean, look, this was a tough one for me. All the top guys that I had were some of the top guys: JP Duplessis, Adrian Boyson. I mean, those are kind of my staple forward, my staple back, all out. Potros doesn't end up starting, so I don't have a kicker. So I was going into the week very scared, and you can see that by the final point score, it's not your usual rock and roll 90 points, right? So obviously silly. I had to squeak out this one. I had to finesse it a little bit. I had to do some fantasy wizardry by picking up Shane O'Leary last minute, just the usual happenings from a week-to-week basis. But let's not talk about me. I think there's other guys that we should talk about, Ryan. We don't have to talk about my squeezing out that performance. We can talk about some other things.
I think you're getting the definition of humble mixed up here on this
show.
No.
I'm being humble this episode.
But let's talk about, some of these other matchups. Rugby Morning taking on the Feral Hippies, 78.3 to 71.2. Rugby Morning comes out on top. Tough for the Feral Hippies, who has been trying to claw his way back into a playoff spot here. Again, the top 6 teams in our Fantasy Ruckers League make it into the playoffs. You look at what Rugby Morning has been able to do. He's been racking up the wins, has high point total, sits third in the rankings now. This was a big time win for him. Lads on Tour. Wow. Putting up a massive point performance. The former champion, I should say the most recent champion of the Fantasy Ruckers League, the guy that has his name, the only name, etched on our Fantasy Ruckers League championship jersey that is behind me here. If you're watching on the YouTube video, he takes on Dankus Anchors, and the Dankus Anchors put up the third highest point total of the week, but they ain't enough to take down 103.4 points racked up by Lads on Tour. And if I am correct here, I think this is just the second time or the second team this season that has cracked the triple digit points.
Second team. I mean, I've done it twice, so I don't know if you want to count that as 2.
Where is the You said humble, and you come out with that. What are you doing here?
No, I'm humbling. That was
Yeah,
the
okay.
previous weeks. That was previous
Oh,
weeks that I
right,
did
right.
it.
I forgot.
I'm humble
I
moving
forgot.
forward now
Okay. Yeah.
because I
Right.
only scored 73 points, not the
Right.
usual 150.
Okay.
Yeah. But lads on tour, anyways. Back to lads on tour. He's been firing the past few weeks. I mean,
Yeah.
103 points, 94 points, and yeah, I mean, I posted in the Discord. His team seems to be picking up at a nice little spot here for him.
Absolutely. And then MLR stats taking on Rugby Wrap Up. It seems like
MLR
Rugby
stats,
Wrap
too.
Up. Yeah, I know. MLR stats started a little bit of rough this season. Been also picking it up. Rugby Wrap Up started off hot at the start of the season. Has been struggling the past couple weeks, and MLR stats takes advantage. 96.5
Yeah.
points to 68, second highest point total on the week. And yeah, MLR stats shoots
Do
up
you know what's
the rankings.
interesting, Ryan? New York faced Toronto. Rugby
Yeah.
Wrap Up is a New York heavy team.
Yeah.
Toronto being a very Toronto, MLR stats being a very Toronto heavy team. It was essentially like a
No
inception
kidding.
of the matchup.
That is very interesting. A little bit of a different result here, but nonetheless, I guess that's what makes fantasy MLR so interesting. And then
The
the
big
last
one, Ryan.
matchup. This is the big one. This was the matchup of the toilet bowl this
Yes.
season so far. Going into it, give me the loots. I mean, MLR All Access has been struggling so far this season. They're still searching for that first win for their MLR franchise history here.
Yeah.
And after this week, they're still searching for that win. The Rucking Goat, Vandy, he is on the show here to kind of talk about his big victory, but he was able to get business done, 79.8 to 64.8
Without a scrum half.
without a scrum half. He shoots up the rankings, not in last anymore, or excuse me, not in second last anymore. He goes up a little bit, racking up that point total. And yeah, Rucking Goat making that push for playoffs.
And
It's
we'll
very
talk about this later on, but he's happy LaRue Milan is back on that bench. LaRue Milan,
kidding.
with the way he played, and we'll talk about it more, he's going to find himself back in that starting roster, and Vandy's going to be reaping the benefits.
All right, so
MLR, let's move on.
So let's see what this has implied here on the standings now. So of course, I mean, all of our listeners and viewers know because Matt's humbly made it very clear.
Yes.
On where
You don't even have to
stands.
say my name at the top there, Ryan. We can just skip it. You don't have to say that I have 705 points.
Oh yeah, all right. We'll leave it at that. But yeah, 7 wins, 1 loss. How many weeks in a row is that you've won now?
7. No, I think 6.
6. All right, interesting.
5.
So
5.
Okay, 5 wins in a row. You're sitting at the top of the standings there. But man, I wouldn't be too comfortable. Lads on tour is looking very good, and he's only 1 win behind you, 6-2 now, second place. Rugby Morning comes in at third at a 5-3 record. Big point total for him as well. MLR stats, you got a 5-3 record as well, just below Rugby Morning with regards to the points for. So he sits in fourth. Rugby Wrap Up, who's dropped a little bit here in this kind of playoff race, 4-4. He sits in the 5th spot. Dankus Anchors at 4-4 is in that 6th spot, last playoff spot there. And then you got Feral Hippies, Rucking Goat, Eagles Overseas, all 3-5, 7, 8, 9 respectively. It's going to get tight there, and it kind of reflects almost what the MLR standings kind of look like right now. And we'll get into that a little bit more too. But it's just as tight, especially in that Eastern Conference, as it is in the tail end of this playoff race here, which is very interesting to see. And of course, MLR All Access sitting there. I'm still looking for their first win. Also,
I think
kind
he
of
needs to start
reflection.
listening to maybe some of my advice. I told him not to pick up Mooneyham, and he picks up Mooneyham. And what happens to Mooneyham? He does nothing.
That's true. I mean, I did talk to some of the people there that run the league or run that team, and they were pretty pumped to have Connor Mooneyham, but obviously not paying forward here through round 8. But nonetheless, yeah, interesting stuff here in these standings, and it is very, very good stuff. I will give a shout out since we are mentioning MLR All Access, and I mean this is the league update portion. Had an awesome time, by the way, hopping on MLR All Access this week. Got to talk a little bit about fantasy rugby. Got to talk about some of the top players in the league.
Maybe I may not have shouted out one of my players, but no
maybe a couple. Got to talk with Stacy and Mark. They were great. They say hi to everyone here. And yeah, it's been fun. So if you haven't seen, I'm sure you can check that out. I believe on the Rugby Network if you want to watch that back. But I had a super great time talking and representing the Fantasy Ruckers there on MLR All Access.
Yeah, I heard word on the street is you're a friend of the show.
I'm a friend of the show, apparently. So
Look at us go.
look at us go. All right. You ready to break down some of these round 8 matchups?
Let's do it. This was a good one.
This was a very good week. All right, let's get into it now. I guess we start off here. The first, and again, all matches were on Saturday. It was Easter weekend. Gave the players a little bit of a break there on the Sunday, and to have them enjoy the holiday. So we had a jam-packed Saturday of rugby. I mean, Saturday is a rugby day. We all know that if you've played club.
Yep.
So let's start talking about it. Starts at 2:00 Eastern time. New England taking on the Chicago Hounds in New England. I mean, what can you say here? Chicago's still struggling. New England taking care of business. One of the better teams in the Eastern Conference. They win 31-19.
Yeah, I mean, it was super interesting. They come in with Reese McDonald sitting at 10. Poitras's off again. I already said that, but I mean, the big one in the lineup was we see Leroux Milan back on the bench, and everybody was wondering, when was he coming back? When was he coming back? And I just want to highlight the way that he came off the bench. I think it was 28 minutes he played. The impact that he had was just phenomenal. Yeah, it was clear that they were missing him, and even though at the top of the table, I think New England Free Jacks are a team that we really look as a team that could probably continue to improve. And Leroux Milan's going to be a big part of that, clearly.
And then from the Chicago Hounds perspective, they just look like they're not a squad that's really meshing right now.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd expect that to happen for a team in their first season in the league, first off season, trying to build this up. They're still trying to kind of establish what they do over there in Chicago. It looks like it's obviously going to take a lot longer than just one season to right off the get-go. I know there was a lot of hype going into it because of the names that they had on this squad, but I guess that goes to show you how important the team part of rugby really is when it comes to this game. So,
and mind you, I mean, those names are performing, right? Bill Meeks of the world, the Mark O'Keefe's, the Bryce Campbells, they're all performing. They're all living up to their standards, especially fantasy-wise. It's just, like you said, there's a lot more to it than just living up to the standard fantasy-wise. I will say, though, a bright light for Chicago is having Hugh Roach back, and having Hugh Roach go out there and do Hugh Roach things. So
absolutely.
He was a huge part of that, a huge Roach part of that, that Chicago team. And win or lose, I think he's continuing to play a big part.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into some of these players from a fantasy perspective and who's really performing here. I mean, for me, this was an interesting matchup because there wasn't really anyone that popped necessarily, at least from a big time scoring perspective. But I mean, there's a few guys here. Mitch Jacobson, really good. Scores the try, not that many meters gained, but 25 tackles. You combine that all together, 16.9 fantasy point performance. You've really been waiting for Mitch Jacobson to really do something. I think we talked a lot about him leading up to this season and the experience that he comes from overseas. This was a big one. Yeah,
this is probably the performance you're waiting out of him. Honestly, probably could have expected a little bit more meters gained. But yeah, this is kind of what we've been waiting for. He's been leading up there, trending in that direction, but it was nice to see this game come out of him.
Yeah, absolutely. I will mention as well, Jesse Peretti looked okay. New signing, 44 meters gained, 24 tackles. And again, we're starting to see how important this stat column really is to provide these consistent performances. He's been a guy that's kind of been struggling.
He loves red cards.
He loves red cards. Got that red card in the fourth round there. Didn't appear until the seventh round. Didn't really do much there, but it kind of not necessarily breaks out here, but at least is somewhat fantasy relevant in this one. The big one also I want to mention, you talk about one of the centers there with Leroux Milan, but Ben Lesage, 13.1 fantasy points on the day, 99 meters gained, 14 tackles. Again, it's that tackle baseline that's really keeping these guys at a fantasy relevant level. And then let's talk about Leroux Milan. Let's talk about what he was able to do in his first appearance coming off of the bench. Still 13 fantasy points, 50 meters gained, and scoring that try as well. For a guy that was drafted in the first round, expected to be kind of that marquee guy for this team, and we know how important center positions and how fantasy relevant the center position can be. If this is someone that when he starts to implement himself in the starting lineup, which I would expect he is in there relatively soon once he gets back to full health, this is a guy that's going to reap the rewards of that first round fantasy value.
Yeah, what a ridiculous try assist. The guy just kicked it into the corner, and Balacano was just, I think it was Balacano, just kind of was there, just had to run after. What a
Yeah.
ridiculous try assist. Somebody I wanted to bring up. I mean, I mentioned Balacana. He's continuing to do Balacana things, but a guy that I wanted to bring up, John Poland. I thought he had a phenomenal game. I thought he played really well. Outside of the try, outside of putting, unfortunately, Julian Dominguez getting injured while being put in the spin cycle. Um, I thought he played a really, really, really good game at 9, and 12.4 fantasy points at the scrum half position is always something you love to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift on over to the Chicago side of things now. Again, was a game. There were fantasy relevant performances in this one, but no one really popped off. Like we had some guys this week that really popped off, and we're gonna get to it. Some of these guys who really had big fantasy, but we just didn't have that in this game. On the Chicago side, I mean, you mentioned Hugh Roach. Comes back here after being haven't not made an appearance since round 3. 11.9 fantasy point performance for a front row player.
Love to see it.
12 tackles, adds the try. Pretty solid stuff. That's what you try. That's what you're looking production wise from Hugh Roach.
I was watching the Chicago set piece actually looks pretty good. I mean, when they get an opportunity down in the 22, when they get an opportunity to do this, like run a set piece play, they look pretty good. And unfortunately, that doesn't get you wins. But when you look at guys like Hugh Roach, guys like Lindsey Stevens, those guys have been reaping the benefits and reaping the rewards from that.
I mean, the question then becomes, though, is how often are the Chicago Hounds finding themselves in that position, though? And that's I guess kind of the devil's advocate point there. But another player that looked pretty good, JP Eloff. I mean, when he does start, he's pretty solid. I mean, 77 meters gained here, 6 tackles, adds the try, 15-point fantasy point performance. He's a volatile player. You don't know what you're going to get with him on a weekly basis, but this past week he looked pretty good.
Yeah, no, he looked great, and he's one of those guys. Well, one of the guys that we had high expectations for. And then just another guy I'll bring up before we move on to the next game is, Bill Meeks, kind of doing what you expect from him. Another guy, another center who just constantly finds his way to get his head in the ruck and constantly get those breakdown steals for you. And that's just another proponent of him being able to get more points for you.
Yeah, I mean, back-to-back weeks with 2 steals, breakdown steals, which is pretty solid. He had 14.9 fantasy points in this one, 85 meters gained, 8 tackles. Didn't score a try. If he scores a try there, he's the guy that we're talking about in this matchup, at least from an explosive fantasy performance in this one. But again, this New England Free Jacks Chicago matchup didn't really have anyone that really busted out here and looked really, at least fantasy-wise, that was going to win you any weeks here. Wasn't going to lose you necessarily weeks, but wasn't going to win you in this performance here. Let's shift over to the next matchup of the day, though. This one, wow. The Toronto Arrows going back home. We said that this is a team that can perform when they're back home. They're a different type of team.
Yep.
They took it to the New York Ironworkers, man. And I think the name that I got to mention here, Desean Bowen. Desean Bowen. I'll say it one more time. Desean Bowen. I got to say it 3 times. He's scoring 3 tries in this week. Player of the week. 25th player in the history of the MLR to score a hat trick in a game. The second in Toronto Arrows history. Yep. Desean Bowen on his own almost was able to bring home this victory for the Toronto Arrows over the New Ironworkers. Just falling short, though, 29-27.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm going to call him the apostrophe. Sean Bowen. No, he played a great game. He had some of the best individual tries from the weekend. I mean, the way that he was able to kind of just use pace to break tackles, and it was awesome to see. I think regarding the game overall, I think Rugby New York really had I really had a lot of dominance in that game, and Toronto was just able to take advantage of a lot of mistakes. I mean, you look at the first try as a perfect example of just being able to take advantage of that mistake that New York made, the turnover and just turning it around quickly. With that being said, though, Toronto is putting together some of the best phases that we've seen him play all season. We see him putting together. I mean, one of those is I forget who scored the try, but it was an assist by Fabian Goodall. But it was essentially from the 50 down to the end zone. It was just phase rugby, and it was perfect. And it was something that you've expected and wanted to see out of the Toronto Arrows all year long. And you know what? We knew it was going to show up at home. We saw the crowd. We heard the noise through the broadcast. It was bound to come out, and we've been calling for it. So in my mind, start picking up your Toronto players because those guys are coming. They're coming
Yeah.
strong. And when you go to Toronto, it's not an easy win.
Yeah, they have they'll have a nice little stretch here at home. But yeah, well, let's talk from a fantasy perspective now. We talked about how the New England Free Jets Chicago matchup, not really, from a fantasy standpoint necessarily anything impressive, but in this one there was no shortage of players that were fantasy relevant in this one. We'll start on the New York side of things before we get to Desean Bowen's big time performance. But you look at the New York Ironworkers. I mean, you had 4 different guys hitting triple digit meters gained, right? Nick Feeks, 125, Andrew Coe, 138, Tay Walden, 150, and Quinn Nagawati, 121. That's impressive. And then you add tries in there as well for all of them. I mean, from a fantasy perspective, let's look at those numbers here. You look at Andrew Coe, 20.5 fantasy points in this one. 1 try, 138 meters gained, 4 tackles. Tay Walden, 23.3 fantasy points on the week. 150 meters gained, 1 try, 6 tackles. You look at the next one there. Quinn Nagawati, 15.7 fantasy points, 121 meters, 1 try assist, 2 tackles. And then finally there, you look at what Nick Feeks was able to do, who hasn't necessarily had as many opportunities here this season so far to really stand out from a fantasy perspective. But every time that he's started, right, he's only played 3 matches so far this season. He scored double-digit points, and in round 8, it was 19.3 fantasy points, 125 meters gained, 1 try. Man, these New York backs have the ability to put up a lot of fantasy points on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like Andrew Coe, Nick Feeks, I think this is kind of something that we expect to see out of them. For me, Tay Walden is really coming into form. I thought this game was him really kind of showing the world of MLR, his impact and the impact that he can have on defenses. And when you have that in your centers, the way that he's able to get go forward ball, the way that he's able to not only be a ball carrier, but also a ball mover and a playmaker. I thought that was great to see, and I love to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then just going down the list in terms of other guys that were somewhat relevant, it's interesting. You didn't really see the New York front set piece really do as much, at least from the front positions. Not as many big tackles either that you see. No one surpassing double-digit tackles here on the New York side of things.
I mean, I guess that kind of explains the type of game that was.
Sure. Which is why you see so many fantasy points. But now shifting over to the Toronto side.
I mean, hold on, before we go over, just big thing to talk about in this game. Jack Hyden with the injury. Let's hope that he's all right. That has a big fantasy impact, because if you have Jack Hyden, rugby wrap up, what are you going to do? Sam Windsor's coming in now. Sam Windsor played pretty well when he came in. So that'll be interesting to see what that looks like in the coming week.
Absolutely. I guess we got to talk about it. Desean Bowen.
We got to talk about it.
Desean Bowen. I'll say it 3 times every single time. 34.5 fantasy points on the season. Performer of the week, both from a fantasy standpoint and player of the week from the MLR, like we said. 152 meters gained, 3 tries, 11 tackles. This guy was going to win you this week on his own if you had him on your roster. Now, the interesting thing with him is that he wasn't on anyone's roster, and no one expected Desean Bowen to do this in his second appearance, first time at home with the Toronto Arrows. You can imagine that this is going to be a guy that we'll get to here in the waiver wire segment that is probably going to get a lot of bank put on him as a flyer.
I mean, look. A lot of bank might be put on him. If you listen to me in the waiver wire segment, you'll see why I think you shouldn't. But we'll get there.
All right. Well, Desean Bowen, big time performance there.
I think, I mean, some guys that I want to bring up, right? We got to talk about Lolani Faleva. We have to talk about him every week, because every week, when I said 4 weeks ago, this guy is a front row to pick up. This guy is explosive. He continues to prove. He must have heard us, right? Because he continues to prove me right. Every week he finds his way to get the ball. Every week he finds his way to be part of a crucial part of the offense. Finds a way to break the line. Finds a way to just be in the right space and be able to have open field to run with, which you don't expect from a prop. And he continues to have explosive plays. And those meters gain that he gets every game is just carrying him as a front row and not something that you expect.
Yeah, I mean, 3 out of the past 4 weeks in fantasy scored double-digit points, which is pretty solid for a front row player. Doesn't even need a try within that space either. He's only scored 1 try out of those 4 weeks either. Out of those 4 weeks, he's surpassed the 50 meters gain mark 3 out of 4 times as well. This past week, he hit double-digit tackles for the first time. Yeah, I mean, Lolani Faleva is a guy that definitely is holding his own at that front row position. And now that you know that the Toronto Arrows are at home, they perform better. He might be a guy that you're looking at in terms of what he's able to do and the impact he may have on your fantasy squad. A couple other guys that I want to mention here on the Toronto side. Mitch Richardson looked all right. 181 meters gained, 11 tackles, hits the double-digit point performance with 10.4. And then the other guy I want to mention is Ross Brody. He put up the 16.2 fantasy points, had big time meters gained. They're explosive, 103 meters, and 8 tackles for a scrum half is pretty solid with 2 try assists. This is kind of the performance that you expect from a good scrum half.
I mean, this is a performance that we expected out of Ross Brody. Like last year, we saw the way that he was able to be an offensive threat. The past 3 games, we've seen him kind of start racking up, whether it's just tries, whether it's meters gain, whether it's try assist and meters gain. It's something that we've seen in the past 3 weeks. And this is what we kind of expect out of him. And I would expect us to continue to see that grow as they're on this little home stretch here.
Yeah.
Before we move on to the next game, Ryan, I got to bring up Fabian Goodall.
Okay.
That's 4 weeks in a row, 5 weeks in a row that he's played where he's gotten double-digit points.
Leading scorer right now for the Toronto Arrows.
Yeah, and
from a fantasy standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. And it's clear to see that maybe he doesn't always have the meters game, but they're looking for him. Exit strategy. When they're trying to get out of their 22, Fabian Goodall's the guy that they hit. When they're trying to make gain line, Fabian Goodall's the guy to hit. He really drove this week with the tackles. But in coming weeks, it seems like he's going to be a big part of their game plan, whether it's exit, whether it's inside the 22, or whether it's inside between the 22s as well.
And for those of you who are curious and looking kind of maybe if you'll take a shot at some of these Toronto Arrows guys, knowing that they're at home, they got their next 2 weeks at home in this stretch here. But 2 tough matchups though too, so it may cause a little bit of a debate here whether you really side with the New England Free Jacks this week than the Seattle Seawolves after that. So we'll have to see kind of how that kind of shakes things up in terms of how you feel about Toronto Arrows fantasy wise over the next 2 weeks. All right, let's move over to the next matchup. And we're kind of flip-flopping back and forth here between really good fantasy games and not so good fantasy games. This kind of falls, I would say, even worse than the New England Free Jacks Chicago matchup when it comes to the fantasy output that you're looking for in this matchup. Really not much there. Not many big-time performers in this one. I mean, you had guys scoring tries. You look at Rugby Atlanta, Tarangatira Waitokia, double try performance there, 53 meters gained, and was able to put up 16.2 fantasy points, which is pretty solid. But outside of that, and if you weren't scoring a try in this one, you really weren't fantasy relevant whatsoever. But just overall thoughts though, with this Rugby Atlanta Old Glory DC matchup, Rugby Atlanta off the get-go. I mean, they were up so early, so quick, and really Old Glory DC was playing on the hind foot. They've been really susceptible to that so far this season, and it seems like it's been a common theme for them of them trying to claw themselves the way back. But yeah, I mean, Rugby Atlanta at the end of the day holding on and able to take care of business. And what was really, the score I think reflects a lot closer of a matchup than what it really was.
Yeah, I mean, Old Glory DC really had their second half. They really started coming back. But yeah, I thought Rugby Atlanta, for the most part, really kind of controlled this game. It was actually a nice game to see out of them because they're one of the teams that we didn't really, aren't too confident in. Yeah, it must have been the peach jerseys. I would say that those peach jerseys are not very flattering for the big boys. But look, it is what it is. I just want to give a quick shout out while we're on this game. Old Glory DC has by far the best social media presence during games. In terms of if you're not able to watch the games, which I wasn't able to watch the full game, you're able to keep yourself updated with their Twitter, which some teams are just brutal at. I mean, they are not posting anything.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just want to point that out. But yeah, to your point, right? I think it was a wet game as well.
Wet and cold.
Wet and cold, not too much fantasy, but there are some guys that did have some impact, and I think they're the usual suspects that we always call out in these games.
I mean, I just mentioned Tarangatira Waitokia, who was there. I mean, Ruida Biddle, he scored the try, but didn't really do anything from a meters gain standpoint. Only 8.6 fantasy points there. No one at least on the Rugby Atlanta. You look at Ross Deacon, who was able to get a decent amount done, 89 meters gained for him. Leading to a 10.7 fantasy point performance. But really on this Rugby Atlanta side, there was no one that was really impressive outside of Tarangatira Waitokia's 2-try performance side. You want to move over to Old Glory DC, guys?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, one guy we got to talk about, I think we talk about him every week, is Jameson Banana.
It's the tackles, Schultz. Man. It's crazy.
I mean, it's every week that he finds a way to just rack up points. Whether his team is playing well, whether his team is losing, as Old Glory DC has been doing, he finds a way to just rack up the fantasy points, and that's the type of guy that you love to have on your squad.
And that's the difference, right? That's the difference of being just like an MLR match analyst and analyzing it from just a lens of just, okay, what is the rugby that we're watching here, and how good is it, and how are they performing, versus from a fantasy performance standpoint? Because Jamison Fanana Schultz is a guy that I would want on my fantasy team every single day of the week. I mean, double digit, like over 15 tackles in 7 of the 8 weeks that he's 6 of the 8 weeks, 6 of the 7 weeks that he's played. Sorry, bad math there. 6 of the 7 weeks that he's played. His lowest on the season is still double digits, 10 tackles. It's only been going up so far. I mean, he had 15 in round 6, 21 in round 7, 22 in round 8. And those are numbers that you can rack up even when your team is not performing. And these are some of the guys that you got to pinpoint from a fantasy strategy standpoint on these teams that maybe not be doing so well, that there are guys and pockets that you can find where they are very fantasy relevant, and it could be the complete opposite in terms of really making a huge difference on your fantasy build. And Jama is one of those guys that really does that. Shifting over to another guy, didn't start the matchup, but I mean, Thread and Palamo looking good, man. Like 105 meters gained, 1 try. If he can find himself in a starting lineup here with Old Glory DC, if they decide to shake things up with their lineup, I mean, he's a guy that you may look at who's definitely available in our league, who could start maybe, doing some stuff, because it's not everyone that can do what he did in the 21-minute span that he was on the pitch.
Yeah, I mean, he's always had these ability to be explosive. I mean, he's a vet US Eagle. And also he used to play for the Steelers, right? Palamalu, right? So
good one.
I mean, I think a lot of those meters gained were definitely from the try that he had. That was a pretty long try assist from the pass from Penny Lasaka, but regardless, he has the ability. That just shows he has the ability to find himself in the right space and be explosive and end up putting up points.
I will also mention Marcos Young. I know he was a big waiver wire pickup, I believe, last week on the wire. He's a guy that's gone 3 straight games with double-digit point performances.
Yeah, maybe. But outside of that one try, right, I think he has a completely different week.
Sure, and I get that, but I mean, it is promising to see that he's done in the past. You talk about the cold, you talk about the wet. I mean, he has the ability to at least save those point performance. Volatile, of course, he's a back 3 player. That's going to happen. But still was able to squeak somewhat of a performance too. But once again, this matchup, not many fantasy points to be had. You look at Jama, he was probably the best performer just because of the tackles he was able to rack up, and obviously the 2-try performance by Tarangatira Waitokia. But outside of that, again, not really a matchup that had much.
We're gonna have to talk about this in a future episode. I don't want to get into it now, but I know Tusi Tala had a good game in terms of scoring a try, getting 11 points.
I mean, it was a quick tap.
But man, does this guy have to be one of the busts of the year?
He might be.
But, we'll leave it at that, right? I'll throw that out there, and we'll leave it at that. We'll get to it when we have more time to get into that.
All right, let's shift on over now to the second last matchup of the day. Yeah, game of the week. Seattle Seawolves taking on San Diego Legion in a battle of the top of the Western Conference. Seattle coming into this matchup undefeated.
Yeah.
San Diego been riding on a high. They have been looking electric this season so far. And it's the San Diego Legion away from home coming away with the 3-point victory, 23-20. Matt, last episode you said it, San Diego was going to win. I thought that the Seattle Seahawks were going to take advantage of that home field presence. Nonetheless, San Diego coming in there and be able to get that done. Pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah, I mean, San Diego Legion just, we expect them to be high scoring. We expect them to be putting up points, but they were able to, stay in that first half, play the defensive battle, play that game with Seattle, and be able to really shut them down. And then they found their opportunities and they scored when they needed to. And that's really all you can ask. I think it was an unreal game just all around. But San Diego, I think, just inched it out, eked it out, and was able to just score, be a bit more explosive, score a little bit more points like they're used to doing.
And I think right now it's and San Diego is so much fun to watch. Just the style of play that they play with is so electric and so exciting. If you had to choose, before we kind of start breaking down some of the individual players, if you had to choose one team in the league where you have some sort of player stock on a team, where you have a guy like from a team in the league, it's got to be San Diego, right?
Yeah,
it has to be San. I mean, I guess that's an easy answer now thinking back on it, because they're, I guess, what many would consider the best team in the MLR, and you want to have the players on the best team. But I guess from just the play style standpoint and with all that in mind, it sounds like everyone should have a little bit of stock of San Diego, and it sounds like that might be the key if you're going to go for a fantasy title this year.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree there. And you look at across across their whole lineup. Everybody in that starting lineup is finding a way to contribute, right? We're going to enter the players, but I'm just going to segue us into it. You're looking at Poitevin, Blair Cowan, Nate Oxberger, right? Like Thomas Aoaki, Will Hooley. You go across all the board. Everybody is doing their part, and fantasy wise and in real life and on the field. I mean, I didn't even bring up Samuel Malolo. All these guys, in every aspect, in every front row, second row, back row, the backs, and every part, they're all kind of playing their part and doing what they need to do in terms of their role. And it's being reflected in the fantasy world. I mean, you look at the back row, Poitevin, I think 19 tackles, Blair Cowan, 22. You look at Oxberger, he's scoring tries, he's putting up meters gained.
Yeah.
You look at Malolo, I mean, from the front row, he's scoring, I mean, he's putting up a bunch of meters gained as well. So, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think I just called out all the guys, right? So I don't even know if we need to go into
that. I mean, I'll just quickly cycle through kind of the performances. I mean, you mentioned it, Nate Oxberger. I mean, this guy hasn't scored less than 12.3 fantasy points this season. He's been a big contributor, and he was probably the saver of the week for you in terms of getting you this win this past week. 2-try performance, his second 2-try performance on the year, 83 meters gained, 10 tackles, 21.3 total fantasy points. I mean,
it becomes the highest fantasy point scorer in the MLR,
which is nuts. And we'll get into that and into our top rankings there. But yeah, Nate Oxberger, we teased him on our show last episode when we sent out our socials. Rugby Morning came out and says, hey, don't forget about Joe Mano. But I mean, after this week, what Nate Oxberger was going to do, he must have heard something, because he wanted to make a statement and say, you know what? No, I'm actually the best fantasy MLR player. Put me up there. Just incredible stuff. Looking at some other guys that performed in this matchup, you look at David Taimalau. He had a big time performance in this one. Hasn't really been relevant this season so far, but comes out with a 62-meter gain performance, 1 try, and the big one here, 17 tackles in this one. By far his biggest point performance. It was the first time he started this season, so it'd be interesting to see how he kind of moves forward here. Obviously that has a big impact on how he performs. And then you mentioned him, Samuel Malolo. I mean, 123 meters gained from the front row position, 10 tackles, 14.3 fantasy points for a front rower.
It's ridiculous.
It's crazy. He's out of the 6 weeks that he's played, 5 of them he's hit double-digit points, which is insane for a front row player in fantasy.
Yeah, that is insane. And I mean, I think I called in week 1 or 2. This guy is finding ways to be involved, and he's one of those front rows that's kind of like Lalani Faleva, except almost like a more consistent Lalani Faleva, who's also on a better team.
Right, exactly. Shifting over to Seattle's side, I mean, the biggest performer on Seattle was Charles Elton, I think.
Yeah.
40 meters gained, a try, 16 tackles, 13.8 fantasy points. Again, this Seattle performance wasn't really beneficial to the fantasy standpoint of things here. You look at Jordan Chait, he was able to put 15.2 points up with that kicking help there, one conversion kick, 2 penalties, 12 tackles for a fly half, pretty solid stuff. Duncan Matthews even in there, 93 meters gain, a consistent performance, 11.1, but nothing explosive like what you saw from Nate Augsburger on the San Diego side. And maybe
I mean, even then, you look at some of the Seattle guys, and maybe it's a lot lower. And these are just the high expectations that we have for these Seawolves. Is that, you know, when we look at Duncan Matthews, we expect more from him in terms of meters gained and points. When we look at Riker Hatting, you know, I think that's 2 weeks without a try. That's not really what we expect out of him, especially, you know, with everything running through his blood. But then so I had to throw that in there.
Ridiculous. There, keep going.
But you know, I think the one thing to take away from this game is that Jordan Chait AJ Alatimu combo. Is that something we can expect for the future?
It's frustrating.
We talk about how good that Seattle Seawolves center core is and how good Lopetti and Creel has been. And I think this had an impact on Creel. Like, if you look at his points, I mean, I think he still put up double-digit points, but Alatimu's involvement and the way that works, when you have 2 10s on the field and 2 playmakers on field, it changes the way you play.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what that's like moving forward. But speaking of that, Chait had a great game as well.
Yeah. No, that was good. Yeah. Again, outside of those couple players, not really from the Seattle standpoint, anything to really get super excited about. And it could also be as well, I mean, the Seattle play style is not necessarily that complementary to fantasy as well. I mean, if you're not getting the scoring, you're not really going to get these big time explosive plays that you're really seeing from San Diego with the fast pace and the style that San Diego plays with. And again, that's just kind of the mindset that you have to look as you analyze these games through a fantasy MLR lens. All right, let's go to the last game of the week. A shocking result, and I'm sad that Vandy's not here to talk about this because man,
he got a double win this week.
Yeah, Utah
triple win if you count San Diego.
Sure. Utah is sneakily 5-2 on the season. They take down the Houston SaberCats. They're now tied with them and from a record standpoint, still a little bit back because of some of the bonus points that Houston has been able to rack up. But nonetheless, though, Utah coming out with a big-time victory, 30-24 away from home against the Houston SaberCats team that a lot of people were very excited about.
I mean, look, Utah, they were up big in the first half and yes, are at the, leading into the end of the game until Houston started deciding to score 24 points unanswered.
Yeah.
So, was this a case of Utah being good, or was it a case of Houston just kind of similar to Old Glory DC of just being asleep that whole first half, the first kind of 2/3 of the game? And maybe they just didn't take Utah seriously enough, but yeah, it was a high scoring affair. It was nice to see the Houston guys kind of come back, pick up some fantasy points for the boys. And even the guys who had Houston players were able to pick up those points.
Yeah, the two big performers, at least on the Houston side, I mean, Dominic Aquina, 100 meters gain.
Should have been more. Should have been more. A try.
12 fantasy points without that try there, 5 tackles, so could have been an even bigger performance there. And then you look at Drew Wild having a big time performance, 103 meters gain, 11.1 fantasy points there. Again, no one really explosive in this matchup. And then when I shift over to Utah, Joe Mano not making an appearance in this one. So it takes a little bit of a hit on his fantasy standpoint, but you look at some of the other guys, Caleb McEnany scoring a try there, 57 meters gain. The big one for me, though, is Thomas Tuavau, who was able to get 28 tackles in this match, which
I think that's a record.
It might be the most that I've seen.
I think Jam Delay said that was a MLR record.
Dang. So 13 and a half fantasy points with that record hitting performance. But yeah, I mean, you look at that, and then you got to look at also Joel Hodgson. I mean, Joel Hodgson was
Yeah.
pretty clutch from the boot. That's what you want to see from a fly. I'm not necessarily from a fantasy perspective, only 9.4 on the week, but saved it a lot with the kicks that he was able to make that obviously had a big impact in the big time win over Houston. Anyone else that
Yeah.
I'm missing there?
I mean, I'll bring up Logan Tago. I mean, a guy who kind of slotted in for Joe Mano. We don't know how long Joe Mano's out. I think it'll be interesting to see who steps up. And Logan Tago having a good game seems like one of those guys that could be, somebody on the waiver wire that you can snag and play at least until Joe Mano's back.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's shift on over now and let's talk about, I guess, some of these top players in the league right now, because like I mentioned at the top of the show, all the teams have had now at a bye. Now that NOLA has has sat out, and now that Dallas has sat out, every team again all has played the same number of matches. And why that's so big is because we talked about it last episode, how we saw a lot of NOLA Gold players in this top 10, because of the extra match, quote unquote, that they had in the pocket with not having had a bye yet. So it's kind of shaken out yet, and it's kind of evened out. We mentioned Nate Oxberger's at the top here with what he's been able to do this season. Absolutely incredible. Again, hasn't scored lower than 12.3 fantasy points in any of his appearances. His high is 27.6 on the year. His lowest is 12.3. Really impressive stuff. You look at Joe Mano, who's in that second position. He's going to take a little bit of a hit because he's probably not going to be appearing here. At least he didn't appear in last week. Obviously, that 35.6 point performance in round 6 was a big factor in why he's so high in the rankings, but nonetheless, you can't take that away from him. But you come next with David Coates. Him has just been really, really consistent, and it's really been from the boot that has really allowed him to stay up there. I mean, he comes off of a round 8 performance, 3 conversion kicks, 1 penalty kick, has that kind of meters gain ability, at least for a fly half standpoint, and then those 2 tries help in round 8 as well. So he sits at the 3rd spot. But I think the storyline here is now that we know how that all these teams have played the same matches. I mean, the NOLA Gold players are still there. You got JP Duplessis at 4, Tom Florence at 5, and Rodney Iona at 6. That's impressive stuff. These 3 guys, it just goes to show you that this NOLA team has a lot of fantasy relevance. And if it's not San Diego, that maybe you have a player on, NOLA seems to have a lot of players that are producing in fantasy too.
I mean, I think the big thing when we're looking at these guys is the absence of Rugby New York guys at the top.
That's true.
I mean, you see every team except, Dallas Jackals and Rugby New York, and you don't often say those names next to each other. But you get down until the top, 15, 16, and actually the first guy that you see is Adrian Boyson from Dallas before you see a New York guy. So I think that's something interesting to look at as well.
Yeah. I mean, you would expect, teams like, Old Glory DC, who are kind of lower. You expect teams like Dallas. You expect teams like Chicago. You expect teams like Toronto to not really have guys that are up in this top 10, but you don't really expect that from New York. Just to round out the top 10, you got 3, 4, 6. Reichard Hadding coming at 7, Mika Kruse coming at 8, Duncan Matthews at 9, and Mark O'Keefe at 10. So when you look at that top 10, right, just to reiterate, Nate Oxberger, Joe Mano, David Coates, JP Duplessis, Tom Florence, Rodney Iona, Reichard Hadding, Mika Kruse, Duncan Matthews, Mark O'Keefe. You look at guys that were drafted in the first round. I mean, what is it? Only JP Duplessis, Reichard Hadding, Duncan Matthews.
I mean, Duncan Matthews was technically second round.
True, he was on the turn. So really, you only have 2 guys there out of the top 10 that were picked in that first round. And we talked about into the season that maybe some of the volatility and the knowledge going into this draft would be a little bit different because of the stats that we're using. But I don't know if it's a fantasy thing. I don't know if it's just this year there are just different players that are performing. It's crazy to see that to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably the nature of the fact that almost to a different degree from last year, it was so unexpected of who was going to do what.
Right.
Yes, we had a better idea, but at the same time, I think we maybe missed out on a lot of those guys where we didn't know because all we were basing off things were, how they did last year. And some of these guys have just shown us, how much impact they can have in our fantasy league.
Very true. All right. Well, let's now shift on over to some of waiver wire pickups that we can
Yeah.
talk about this week. I guess let's get it out of the way. Let's talk about Desean Bowen, and let's talk about why you think here, Matt, someone shouldn't drop. I wouldn't say, and I think I agree with you here. I don't think anyone's going to be dropping a crazy percentage of their fab on Desean Bowen. Was it a very electric performance? It was. Is it concerning that he's still on a Toronto squad? And who's to know? Maybe it was just a big time performance. But I do still think, though, that some decent amount of money should be placed on Desean Bowen just for
Yeah.
a flyer, because I mean, this is a guy that has a sevens background. He's athletic. He's fast. You give him the scoring opportunities. He's shown it's not anyone. I mean, like I mentioned, only 25 players in the history of the MLR have scored 3 tries in a match. He was
Yeah.
one of them. You take a flyer.
Yeah, I mean, definitely go ahead and take a flyer. Why I proceed with caution is you look at some of those tries. You look at the first try, it's off a turnover. He finds himself in the right place. Yes, he still has a lot of work to do to finish off Ross Brody's, but in terms of, involvement in the offense, it was more so of just, he found the work. He was able to capitalize on that. You look at the third try, real messy scrum. Honestly, borderline knock on. And it just ends up being that it comes out that way, and New York's defense is kind of in shambles. Mind you, New York's defense, and we saw that in the missed tackles, they did not play well. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to discredit Deshaun. The guy was unreal with individual feats and individual performance. The second try was one of the best individual tries of the year. But I think it's still something to proceed with caution. I don't think it's necessarily about the fact that he's on the Toronto team. I think it's just the way that he's involved and the way that, what is he doing when he isn't scoring tries? I think that's something that you need to look at with back 3 guys.
Now, I guess the question is, though, right? You're looking down this free agency that we have in the Fantasy Ruckers League right now. Who else are you putting your money on? You know what I mean? Like,
It's true.
you're looking for something, right? You're looking for something that can maybe turn around your season, especially if you're maybe sitting in those 4, 5, 6, 7 spots where you're fighting for that playoff spot here in the Fantasy Ruckers League. I look at these names, and maybe if you're in a dire need of a streamer of some sort, I mean, I would rather take the risk on Desean Bowen and put some money there than any of these other guys that I see here on the list.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think he's the most appealing one. But I mean, there's other guys that maybe, I think he's the most appealing one at the end of the day. But I also think that, I wouldn't be crying if I didn't put down enough fab on him. Somebody's going to overspend. Somebody's going to overpay for Desean Bowen after a performance like that. And I'm just saying that I think you should let them.
Yeah. That's true. It's true. That's a good point. Anyone else on this waiver wire that kind of catches your attention in terms of things? It just seems like at this point, we're really at the standpoint where there are guys that are going to give you a fantasy impact. It's not going to be a guarantee that they're going to help you.
Yeah.
But there are going to be names there that you're going to look at if you are in need of a streamer in the week. If there's a team that you have on bye that you need to fill a position. If you have injury that you're going through right now that you need to fill a position, it's just picking out some of those names. Names there that you look at.
We got no buys this week, so that's the big thing. I'm looking at 2 matchups. We're looking at San Diego versus Chicago. We're looking at Houston versus Dallas. Toronto is no longer a team that you can kind of just throw off. They're at home. I don't care if it's the Free Jacks.
Sure.
They just put the New York Ironworkers through the ringer. They're going to come out showing strong. So, I think, guys, let's look at Tavita Tamalau. We saw him just come off a big game. Is he going to be starting again, or is Afongia going to be starting? That's something to look at. Whether you want to take a waiver wire stab at that, I don't know. And then, another guy that maybe you want to look at is Vukakato. He had the start this week for Utah. He played pretty well, putting up 9 points, 9 fantasy points. We'll talk about another guy, Ryan, Threadin Palomalo. I mean, it might be interesting to take a flyer. I don't think a lot of fab will be dropped on him. You might be able to take him under the radar and just see if you can get him. If he ends up starting, you keep him. If he doesn't, you drop him and you pick up somebody else. And, the last guy that I do want to talk about and that I really like the way that he looked is Quinn Nawadi. I think it was interesting to see him on the wing, but I thought the way that he was able to inject himself into the game, especially with Ed Fida out, if he continues to be out, I see him continuing to start on the wing
That's a
there.
good
And he had a
point.
great game last week. I was trying to find some Houston guys to pick up, but honestly, I'm not sure I see too many Houston guys that are not already on rosters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I like that pick. And, he might be the guy of the week, Quinn Nawadi, just based on the situation that he finds. But if Ed Fido is still out, he
Yeah.
might be the guy that could pay off at least over the next few weeks as he kind of fills in at that position. But who knows? You're
Yeah.
going to have to see
And
and take
and
that
mind
risk.
you, Ironworkers are up against Old Glory DC. We've seen that matchup before. We know what that looks like. A lot of points.
Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. All right, let's shift on over now to the round 9 preview and give our predictions for this week and talk about maybe any players that we really are excited to see in these matchups. Starts off on Saturday at 6 o'clock Eastern time. You mentioned the Arrows at home against the New England Free Jacks. Should be an interesting one. I mean, again, I think the New England Free Jacks have looked vulnerable at times
Yeah.
this season. Again, they're coming off of a win against the Chicago Hounds, who are not necessarily impressive. Not that Toronto has been any more impressive this season as of yet, but Toronto is at home. So I do think that there is going to be an interesting fight that happens here between these two teams north of the border. But for me, it's going to be a tough matchup here for Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it'll be a tough one, but for me, my pick is still gonna be Toronto. As long as they're at home, I'm gonna pick Toronto.
Okay.
It's called betting odds, 75%, maybe 73% win percentage. I'm gonna take that every day. I'm picking Toronto. Guys you're gonna look out for again are Faleva. I'm gonna see Ross Brody to have a big game out of him too. And then
Yeah.
Fabian Goodall, I expect a big game out of him.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to go New England Free Jacks in this one.
Whatever.
I think it'll be closer than what people think, but again, I think when you're the best team in the Eastern Conference, I think you're going to be able to figure out a way. I know Toronto's very good at home, but it's going to be tough against this Free Jack
And
squad. Storyline, at least for me. Sorry, Matt, I'll
Yeah.
let you go here. Leroux Milan. We watch what happens there.
Yeah.
Because from a fantasy standpoint, I think that's the most exciting storyline moving forward here.
I
Seeing
think-
how he interjects himself in the lineup.
Yeah, I think the way it's going to be, Ryan, is Potros, Leroux Milan, Ben Lesage. That's going to be the three. That's how it was essentially for the last 28 minutes, and I think they looked real good then.
Yeah. All right. Shifting now to the next matchup on Saturday, the Houston SaberCats taking on the Dallas Jackals at home in the Battle of Texas, 8 o'clock Eastern
The
time.
Dogs versus the Cats.
Dogs versus the Cats. That is right. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the easy pick. Houston's gonna rebound from what was a tough matchup against Utah. Not happy with that performance. The Dallas Jackals are Dallas Jackals. Obviously, they're coming off of a bye. They're coming off their first franchise victory in the history of
Right.
their existence. But
You
it's
got to
gonna
make
be
sure
tough one.
Dallas Jackals come out of this bye healthy. I haven't heard any news yet.
No
I heard
platforms.
they stayed away from all the scaffoldings that they could. So I'm glad to hear that. But yeah, Houston SaberCats. Like I said, I think this is going to be a game where you're going to pick up the Houston SaberCats if you need a streamer in a position. That's where one of the matchups where I'd go to.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see kind of some of the lineup decisions that are made here with this
Yeah.
Houston SaberCats squad against the Dallas Jackals, because we have seen before too
Also,
that teams
where's Gideon Van Vyk or
Right.
Van Vick?
That's what I was gonna say.
That's the big one that we're looking for. Also, if he's hurt right now, what's the point of him coming back for this match? It doesn't make sense. So
right, exactly.
I doubt he comes back. I had Wyden Grassman. I mean, maybe he's a start, but you'll have to see.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Shifting over. So we're both Houston there. Shifting over now to the next matchup is Saturday, 8 o'clock Eastern time as well. NOLA Gold taking on the Rugby Atlanta at home. NOLA coming off the bye. Rugby Atlanta obviously coming off that victory against Old Glory DC.
I think Nola Gold is going to wear their crocodile jerseys, crocodile
Are they?
jerseys. I don't know. I'm assuming they're at home. It's that everybody's wearing their city edition jerseys. It's about
Right.
time for Nola Gold to wear their
I
crocodiles.
guess we'll see how it looks on TV. But yeah, I'm gonna go with the NOLA Gold on this one. I think I'm starting to warm up to the idea, Matt, that you're You've been right about this Nola Gold team. I was scared off of the first few weeks that they showed in this season, but they have been turning some things around. I even went as far when I was on the Road to Glory podcast earlier this week to say that if I had to pick my final right now, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw Nola Gold in the final.
You know what? You're not alone in that, because I see people on Twitter posting that they wouldn't be surprised to see Nola. I've been saying it since what, Ryan?
We're all
January,
bandwagoners. Yeah, it's
December,
true. And you stuck with them through the thick and thin here.
I'm going Nola Gold.
Yeah.
I'm going Nola Gold. I'd be interested to see if Jordan Trainer's back this week. I think if he is, he's gonna have a big game, and Vandy's gonna love it.
And my big thing coming out of this week is, how do these Nola Gold players jump in the rankings after this performance against Rugby Atlanta, right? They're coming off of a bye. Things have evened out here in the fantasy rankings in terms from an individual player standpoint. What are we seeing from Tom Florence? What are we seeing from Rodney Iona? What are we seeing from JP Duplessis?
Yeah.
Are they going to keep up the output that they've had this season long to keep?
And how do they look?
Six?
How do they look with a crocodile on their chest?
That's true. Maybe they'll be a little bit faster. All right, shifting to the last matchup of Saturday, 9:30 Eastern time. Utah taking on Seattle at home. This is gonna be an interesting one because I don't think you can count out Utah. I don't think you can. I know that with this Utah team, there's always the second guessing here, but they're 5-2, man, and they just beat Houston. I get it that Houston almost clawed their way back, and at times this Utah team is not necessarily a team that you can be all that confident in. Seattle is coming off of a very tough loss against San Diego. They are going to be motivated, but I don't think it's going to be a complete blowout here by Seattle.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think that Seattle's going to really grab this one and dominate the game.
Yeah, well, I think Seattle's going to win too, but I don't think that Utah is going to make it easy for this team either. And I mean, Seattle's like vulnerable. They've lost 2 in a row? Or no, excuse me. They've had close matchups here. They've lost the one, but they've had close matchups over these past couple of weeks, which has been definitely somewhat of a concern. But nonetheless, these are the former undefeated team, Seattle Seawolves. Yeah, I think I'm going to go Seattle here. Obviously, I think the storyline every single week with this team is what we're seeing from Jordan Chait, AJ Alatimu, who we're going to see starting at that position, and how does that affect the players around them. I feel like that's going to be kind of the biggest storyline. We'll see whether or not a lot of those players can get back into the fantasy relevance column, because they weren't necessarily as fantasy relevant against San Diego. Okay, moving over to the Sunday's matchup, 3 o'clock Eastern time. Old Glory returns back home. I do think Old Glory is wearing the cherry blossom jerseys this weekend. I do like those a lot. They're welcoming in the New York Ironworkers. They lost in their first matchup with them. Old Glory DC did. It's hard to back this Old Glory DC team right now. They just seem like they're really out of their element. The consistency just hasn't been there right now. It's tough. I'm playing my New York Ironworkers players in this one, especially after what we saw, what they can do against Toronto, north of the border, and just the ridiculous numbers that a whole bunch of those backs were able to put up. It's hard for me to feel like that they won't be able to put at least somewhat of that in this week against Old Glory DC, even though they're away.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you there. I think Rugby New York or New York Ironworkers has a great game this weekend. Yeah, again, I would look out for guys like Quinn Nawadi. I would definitely look out for Tay Walden. I think, the Old Glory DC center pairing is not that great defensively. And I think Tay Walden is really going to take advantage of that.
And look for a big time performance against some of the forward players here on this New York Ironworkers team. Even confident enough to say maybe with the Rugby New York set piece as well. This Old Glory DC set piece has been struggling a little bit. They are a little bit undersized as well. It seems like this team seems a little bit undersized, except for Herrera. So we'll see whether or not New York takes advantage there. I'm going New York in this one. I think you're the same here, Matt.
Yeah. And I mean, hey, big storyline, right? Tito Diaz-Bonilla. Is he back? Is he hurt? We'll have to see, because he's a big part of their team and a big part of their success. So,
and that would be a sneaky pickup too. If you pick up Graydon Bowd, if he starts at that 10 position, he looked pretty solid from the kicking standpoint towards the tail end of that match there. So maybe he's something that you can put as a streamer if you're looking for a fly half that you need to replace because you're not confident with the matchup that you have right now. I think that'd be all right. Okay, and then moving over to the last matchup of the weekend, 4:00 Eastern time on Sunday, San Diego returning back home to Snapdragon Stadium to take on the Chicago Hounds. I am playing all of my San Diego players, even more confidently than I'm playing my New York Ironworkers players. The Chicago Hounds team is still trying to find their way. San Diego, electric. I think I can confidently say this is the best team in the MLR right now. And I think moreover that, I think their play style complements fantasy rugby the best right now in the entire league. And you want to have players that are on that team.
Yeah, 100% agree. San Diego is going to win this one big. And yeah, just pick up as many San Diego guys. If you need a streamer, lean San Diego because they're going to put up some points here.
Yeah. So both San Diego there. It should be another exciting weekend of rugby. Again, it's a jam-packed weekend. No buys this week. It was an exciting round 8. We'll keep it continuing. Again, I think, and we kind of closed out the show last week, I believe, this way too. But yeah, this Major League Rugby season, it seems just a lot more exciting than years past, especially with how close the standings are, and how exciting it's been.
Everybody has at least one win. And you gotta love it.
Gotta love it. I guess that's the first time in quite a while that's happened. And again, that's not necessarily reflective in our league. MLR All Access still looking for their first victory, but nonetheless, our standings are just as tight as this MLR league, and it's made it a whole lot of fun. This weekend is going to have a lot of implication. Matt, can you keep it rolling here? Make it six wins in a row. Can Vandy keep his roll going to get back into a playoff hunt? Or is some of these league members going to have something to say about that and hopefully take down some of the guys that I know that they are always motivated to take down?
Yeah, it'll be an interesting week. But hey, Vandy, I'm rooting for you, buddy. And remember, be humble. Well, you don't be humble yet, but I got to be humble.
All right. Again, give us a follow at the Fantasy Ruckers. The social links are up above there on your screen. If you're listening on the podcast, in the description there, got the link to the Discord as well. Check out thefantasyruckers.com. All the stats are there. Everything that we've broken down in this show is all there. We appreciate the support. We appreciate everything that people have been saying about Fantasy MLR as we keep this thing going. It's been absolutely fun so far in 2023 as we approach the halfway mark. And next week we'll see whether or not how things have changed here in the Fantasy Ruckers League. Should be a very interesting one. All right, for Matt Yee, for Ryan Yee, we'll see you next week here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
I'm humble at the top.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.